EIP-1559 is probably the most anticipated and potentially the most controversial update to Ethereum this side of ETH2. But what exactly is it, why are people so excited or concerned about it, and how will it affect you? I'll be answering all of those questions and more in today's video. EIP-1559 is a proposal to dramatically change the way transaction fees work in Ethereum, and while it should bring a number of benefits, including one side effect that's got many Ethereans very excited, the update's primary objective is simply improving Ethereum's user experience. 1559 should make it far easier for users, wallets, and dApps to estimate the size of the transaction fee they should pay to have their transactions promptly confirmed. That means users won't face the present-day issues of accidentally underpaying and having to wait hours for transactions to be confirmed, or overpaying to ensure a transaction is included in the soonest possible block. 1559 achieves this by making two major changes. First, it introduces an explicit minimum fee called the base fee into each block and requires transactions to pay that fee to be included. Second, it introduces a degree of flexibility into the size of blocks, allowing miners to create blocks up to twice the size limit if there is enough demand for that. The base fee will change from block to block based on how full or empty that previous block was. If a block is more than 100% full, the base fee of the following block will be increased. Similarly, if a block is less than 100% full, the base fee will be decreased in the next block. So, the cost of having a transaction included in a block will still vary over time, but it will do so in a completely predictable way, with the base fee unable to change by more than 12.5% from block to block. Therefore, it should be much easier to work out how much to be paid to guarantee a transaction is included in one of the next few blocks. Where this gets exciting for many is that the base fee, whatever value it's set at, is completely burned or destroyed with every transaction. We'll get into why this has to happen later, but for now you just need to know that most of the ETH fueling transactions will be removed from circulation instead of being transferred to miners as it is today. Potentially, if the demand to transact is high enough to counteract the perpetual issuance, this could make Ether a deflationary asset. Of course, miners aren't particularly happy with this because they will lose some of their income. They won't lose the entire transaction fee because users will be expected to add a tip on top of the base fee, but in most cases this will be a negligible amount, something like 1 gwei or 1/1 billionth of an ETH per transaction, though certain transactions will tip much more than this. That means that miners will take a bit of a hit with 1559, and some, particularly the miners themselves, would argue that this reduces Ethereum's security, as the incentives it offers to miners is effectively the network's defense budget. This is the source of controversy around this update, and we'll dig into it more later on to see if the reduction in miner income is as bad as it first seems. But before we get into that, and before we really dig into the details of 1559 to answer the questions that you likely have about it, let's first take a step back and understand why we pay transaction fees in the first place. After all, wouldn't the optimum user experience be one that doesn't have transaction fees at all? Transaction fees are something of a necessary evil in open and permissionless blockchains. By design, miners must receive, run, and validate every single transaction that takes place before grouping them into blocks and sending them out to the entire network, where every computer then stores them forever. That means that there is a real and permanent cost of every transaction that is felt by every single participant in the system. Transaction fees act as a kind of tax to make users feel that same cost, dissuading them from making unnecessary or spam transactions that waste other people's resources. Fees also help to prioritise transactions. Blocks are limited in size to minimise the social and computational costs as much as possible, but that limits the number of transactions that can be included in a block. If there are a large number of pending transactions, they can't all be picked up. Therefore, a user with a particularly urgent transaction can pay a higher fee to encourage miners to include it quickly. Generally, transaction fees ensure that the limited resource that is block space is allocated to the people who need it most and receive the greatest benefit from it, as those people will be happy paying the highest fees. Finally, in systems like Ethereum where there will be a perpetual block subsidy, transaction fees give miners a reason to actually bother including transactions. That might sound strange, but there's actually nothing to stop miners creating empty blocks that only have a single transaction paying the block subsidy to themselves, and occasionally that does happen. In fact, it can even be advantageous for miners to do this. Every transaction included in a block makes the block a little bit larger, which means it takes all of the other miners a little bit more time to receive and validate the block before they can start building on top of it. Most of the time, the extra little delay is insignificant, but occasionally two miners will discover blocks in almost the exact same moment. Only one of those blocks will eventually become part of the canonical blockchain, and that is whichever one has a new block built on top of it first. In those circumstances, a larger block is slightly more likely to lose the race and be discarded or uncled, which means the creator of that block will lose out on most of the block reward and the transaction fees in it. They actually don't lose the full block reward in Ethereum because it does pay some compensation to uncled blocks. Transaction fees should compensate miners for the increased risk of their block being uncled, with even a tiny fee of just a few gwei proving sufficient for this. Transactions in Ethereum are far more complicated than transactions in Bitcoin, and their computational costs can vary greatly. Some transactions are very easy to compute, like transferring ETH from one account to another, but other transactions are ridiculously complicated and may involve interacting with multiple dApps with cascading effects that must all be calculated. To fairly price transactions according to their computational cost, every basic operation in Ethereum is priced in a pseudocurrency called gas. Simple operations like addition cost 3 gas, for example, while more complicated operations like querying an account's balance costs 400 gas. Note that these operational gas fees are all fixed for every user and every block. Every addition operation costs 3 gas, and every balance query costs 400. When a user makes a transaction, the cost of all of the small operations involved in it are added up to give the total gas cost of the transaction. But that still doesn't give the transaction fee that the user must pay. To get that, we need to convert to some price in ETH, and gas doesn't have a fixed ETH price. Instead, the exchange rate constantly changes as the market tries to find the exact right price for that moment in time. If there are a large number of transactions, then the gas price will increase as users try to outbid each other, so miners will prioritize their transaction. And if few people are making transactions, then the gas price will decrease because there's no need to compete for block space. However much a user pays for their gas, that number is multiplied by the total gas cost of the transaction to give the total fee in ETH. So a simple transfer of ETH requiring 21,000 gas with a gas price of 100 gwei per unit gas would cost 0.0021 ETH, or just under $4 at current prices. It's worth noting though that no matter how much you pay for gas, it's miners that have final say on which transactions are included in their blocks. It's reasonable to assume that a rational miner would want to stuff their block with as many high-paying transactions as possible, but there's nothing to make them do that. If you look through enough transactions in enough blocks, you'll surely find some that pay substantially less than the market rate for gas at that point in time, and sometimes you'll even find transactions that appear to pay 0 ETH per unit gas. The freedom miners have when selecting transactions mean they can come to all sorts of arrangements with users when it comes to paying transaction fees. For example, they might accept payments in a token like USDC, or they might even arrange off-chain payments if that was beneficial to them. These kinds of unconventional arrangements are relatively rare today, but the fact that they can happen means Ether's status as the default money in Ethereum is at risk. The wholesale displacement of ETH as the network's primary money would be extraordinarily damaging to its value, but that's quite unlikely to happen. So, while this is a concern that's worth addressing if possible, it isn't nearly the biggest issue associated with the current transaction fee system. That will be what we'll talk about in the next section. The fee model used in Ethereum today can be described as a first price auction. In these, bidders submit sealed bids, and the highest bidder eventually wins and has to pay whatever they submitted, even if they later realise that they've bid substantially higher than anybody else. That's one of the big drawbacks of first price auctions. They're really difficult to reason about, and so they often lead to dramatically under or overpaying. A user who needs to make an urgent transaction has to think carefully about what others might be willing to pay and outbid them, or at least be close enough to those other bids that their transaction still makes it into the next block. A user wouldn't want to dramatically overpay, but in some cases it would be much worse to underpay and not be included in a block. That leads to some users bidding far above the necessary gas price. And in his post where he initially discussed EIP-1559, Eric Connor showed that some users are paying as much as 5 times what they needed to because of this. Those would be extreme cases, with the majority of users overpaying by much smaller amounts. But it goes to show how difficult fee estimation is under the current system. To be clear, this isn't just a human problem. The fee estimation tools that you can find online or that are built into wallets suffer from exactly the same issues. They're not good at dealing with volatile gas prices, often leading to underpayments and stuck transactions that confuse newcomers, and they're particularly bad at recognising when a short, sharp burst of demand has subsided and gas prices can be reduced, leading to extended periods with unnecessarily high fees. And on top of all of that, they're potentially gameable by miners. Miners could use various methods to trick the estimators into increasing the gas price, and while that's something that doesn't happen too often, it's another issue that's worth fixing if possible. EIP-1559 will help with that, but it predominantly exists as a solution to the poor user experience issues associated with first price auctions. It wants to put an end to the unpredictable, unnecessarily high gas prices and stuck transactions that we see today. Gas prices shouldn't be something the average user has to think about. They should be hidden away in the background, protecting the network without interfering in its usage. 1559 wants to make that the reality on Ethereum, and in the next section, we'll see how it aims to achieve that. 1559 begins with the concept of the base fee, a number that explicitly states the gas price a transaction must pay to be included in a block. By making this price clear to everyone, the mental costs and difficulties associated with first price auctions are eliminated, and users simply need to choose whether or not to pay the stated price. The base fee cannot be constant throughout time. That wouldn't allow the block space to be efficiently allocated as the demand to transact changes. Ideally, the base fee should move up and down based on that demand, always trying to find some optimum value for that specific point in time. But what exactly does that optimum value look like? Well, we know that at any given gas price, there will be some number of users that are willing to transact because at that specific price, the benefits of making the transaction outweighs the costs. At very low gas prices like 1 Gwei, there will be a huge number of users willing to transact because the cost is so low that almost any benefit outweighs it. Meanwhile, at very high gas prices like 1000 Gwei, very few users will benefit enough to make the transaction worthwhile. If we want Ethereum to always operate at its fullest potential, then the optimum gas price at any point in time will be the price that leaves exactly one block's worth of these worthwhile transactions, as in the price at which demand equals supply, or the market clearing price if you're into economics. But now there is another problem. The only way Ethereum can reliably determine the demand to transact is by looking at how full or empty blocks are. If a block is less than 100% full at any given base fee, then the base fee should be reduced as it's clearly above the market clearing price. But what if the block is 100% full? That could mean that the base fee is set perfectly and the demand and supply are perfectly balanced as we want. But it could also mean the base fee is far too low and there were thousands of pending transactions that just weren't included. Ethereum as a system doesn't know about those pending transactions. It only knows what's included in blocks, and so it has no way of knowing which of those scenarios is correct. The solution to this comes in the form of another major change to Ethereum, the introduction of a variable block size. Ethereum limits blocks by how much gas they consume rather than an actual size in bytes. So just as you can add up the gas cost of every operation in a transaction to see how much gas the transaction requires, you can combine the gas cost of every transaction in a block to determine how much gas the block consumes. Today, a single block can consume up to 12.5 million gas. After 1559, that will continue to be the target. On average, blocks should still consume 12.5 million gas. But blocks as large as twice that size will be allowed. And that's a general rule. Whatever the target block size is set to, the absolute maximum size will be double that. With the ability to push blocks beyond that 12.5 million gas target, it becomes easy to work out if the base fee is too low or just right. If a block is larger than the 12.5 million gas target or is more than 100% full, then Ethereum knows that the base fee should be increased. The amount that the base fee moves up or down will depend on exactly how overfull or how empty the previous block was, and Ethereum will use this equation to determine the base fee. If you plug some numbers into it, you can see that the base fee cannot increase or decrease by more than 12.5% from block to block. Blocks that aren't completely full or completely empty will have a proportionally smaller effect on the base fee, and of course, blocks that are exactly 100% full will have no impact on the base fee as supply and demand have been perfectly balanced at that price. It wouldn't be surprising to see that formula altered slightly in the future as Ethereans gain a better understanding of how 1559 works in the real world. But until that happens, this version should ensure the base fee is responsive enough to adapt to genuine changes in demand without overreacting to very small or very short-lived fluctuations. So we now have the base fee, an explicit gas price that says exactly how much every transaction has to pay to be included in a block, and we have a mechanism that will adjust that base fee up and down in search of the magical market clearing price that will help Ethereum allocate its block space as efficiently as possible at all times. But how can we ensure all transactions are actually going to pay the base fee? Sure, the protocol could just make any transaction that doesn't pay it invalid, but that wouldn't stop users and miners coming to some off-chain agreements to partially or fully reimburse the fee that's paid for a transaction that appears to be valid on-chain. For example, a user might want to make a transaction but not want to pay the full base fee for it. They could go to a miner and make a private arrangement between them to have their base fee paying transaction included in a block, but then have the miners send some of that transaction fee back to them using an L2. As long as miners receive all of the ETH paid as the base fee, they can give some or all of it back to users and undermine the system. So we can't let them have all of the ETH. For this reason, and for a few other benefits that we'll discuss later, the entire base fee will be burned with every transaction. But we've already seen that miners must be given some incentive to include transactions in their block, or they simply won't bother. So burning the entire transaction fee could result in miners continually creating empty blocks. The solution to this is to add a small tip that will go directly to miners. That means the total transaction fee paid by users will predominantly consist of the base fee, which will be burned, with a few gwei added on top as the tip. Tipping also gives users a way of demanding special treatment from miners. If their transaction needs a specific placement in a block, they can tip extra for that privilege. Or if a sudden spike in demand means there are too many transactions for even a double full block to handle, then the tip will help miners prioritize transactions as the system devolves back to a first price auction. At this point, you might be thinking this all sounds like a bit much to deal with from a user's perspective, hardly the UX improvement or simplification that this is supposed to be. So now that we know what's going on the chain, let's talk about what an Ethereum user will actually have to think about when making a transaction. The good news is, most Ethereum users will never have to think about any of this, not unless they actively want to get into the weeds of it. In most basic wallets, you'll simply enter the details of the transaction you want to make as you do today, and the wallet will tell you what that transaction will cost. If the price is acceptable to you, you'll click go, and the transaction will, in the vast majority of cases, like 99% of the time, be included in the very next block. No hassle, no waiting around, just the simple, slick experience that making a transaction should be. Users that really want to get into it and fiddle with their transactions parameters will see and essentially replicate what those simple wallets are doing. They will set two parameters. The first is the tip that goes to miners, which will almost always be about 1 gwei unless you're making a very special transaction. And the second is something called the fee cap. The fee cap defines the maximum amount you're willing to pay for a transaction, including the tip, and it's been introduced to account for potential increases in the base fee. Most of the time, it will be safe to set the fee cap to equal the base fee plus the tip. However, most users and wallets will likely set the fee cap to some higher value, just in case a surge in demand pushes the base fee up before the transaction is included. Whatever the fee cap is set to, every transaction will pay the minimum possible fee every time. This is one of the great and underrated features of 1559. It means you can set the fee cap to allow for any number of double full blocks without ever worrying about overpaying. You know you will always pay the base fee of the block you're included in, plus the tip, and not a gwei more. And as a nice bonus, the fee cap will also allow you to schedule transactions by setting it below the current base fee. Finally, you might be wondering what would happen if you used a wallet that hadn't been upgraded to work with 1559. After all, a non-upgraded wallet wouldn't know about the base fee, and it wouldn't know about the fee cap and tip. It would just continue trying to guess an appropriate gas price as it does today. Fortunately, the developers behind 1559 have considered this, and so Ethereum would interpret these legacy style transactions as a transaction with both the base fee and the tip to be equal to the gas price that was bid by that wallet. So what that means is the miners would accept the transaction and they would claim whatever difference there was between the gas price that was bid and the base fee at the time. So you wouldn't always pay the minimum possible transaction as you would with a true 1559 style transaction, but it means that at least all users can carry on as they are today, even if they're using very old wallets that have been abandoned by their developers. In reality, that scenario will apply to a very tiny number of users, as virtually every wallet and dApp will be ready to support 1559 as soon as it arrives. So this isn't something you need to worry about. In fact, if I've not made it clear enough already, none of this is worth worrying about. If anything here sounds confusing or intimidating, you absolutely will not need to worry about any of it when 1559 is live. Most wallets will automatically set the fee cap and the tip for you, just as they automatically set the gas price for you today. The only difference is they will do a far better job of it. That's what 1559 is all about. By making the cost of inclusion in a block extremely clear and easy to estimate over a short time frame, by constantly adjusting that cost to balance supply and demand, and by introducing flexibility into the size of blocks, 1559 will dramatically improve the experience of transacting on Ethereum, and it will effectively eliminate the time spent waiting for transactions to confirm. And, as has been mentioned several times already, 1559 will also come with some additional side benefits, and in the next section, we'll take a look at what those are. 1559 has three main beneficial side effects that all stem from the burning of the base fee. It will cement ETH's position as the money on Ethereum by preventing fees being paid in other currencies. It will potentially make Ether a deflationary money, and in doing so, it will improve Ethereum's security by making the perpetual block subsidy more acceptable, and by reducing the variability of the security budget. We touched on the first of these benefits earlier. Because Ethereum will burn the entire base fee, and because all transactions that don't pay the base fee will be invalid, miners will lose the freedoms that they have today to make alternative arrangements for transaction fees. Sure, they could still choose to accept USDC or something else as a form of payment, but then they would have to provide the ETH to be burned, so their arrangement is effectively irrelevant from the perspective of Ethereum. Essentially then, 1559 will eliminate the risk of ETH being displaced and losing its monetary premium. The second benefit is the one that receives all the attention. If the base fee is high enough that the total amount of ETH burned in each block is greater than the block subsidy, then Ether will become a deflationary asset. This isn't guaranteed, of course, as we don't know how things will evolve in the future, but everything that's taken place over the last year or so suggests more ETH will be burned than created once 1559 is in place. How much more is difficult to say, and in all likelihood it won't be nearly as significant as some people are suggesting. So I think this is a situation where the meme and the idea of 1559 are much more powerful and important than the reality. The introduction of 1559 and the fee burn could be a landmark moment for Ether as an asset. For years, Ethereans have argued that ETH is money in the same vein as Bitcoin, and yet it's still widely viewed as a digital oil instead. There are likely many reasons for this, but I suspect a big one is that it lacked a clear and credible monetary policy when compared to Bitcoin. With 1559, there will still be a degree of complication and complexity there, but the general idea is much simpler, and there will be something very real to point to when explaining why ETH is an attractive store of value and potential money. At the very least, even if 1559 doesn't help Ether receive widespread recognition as a money, the deflationary pressure of the fee burn should create a much stronger relationship between the success of Ethereum the platform and Ether the asset. It means Ether is a much more attractive hold for anybody who believes in the potential of Ethereum, while previously it might have made more sense to express that bullishness using investments in the app layer. Overall then, this could be a very beneficial update for Ether as an asset, and so it's no surprise people are very excited for it. Perhaps more important though is 1559's impact on Ethereum's security. The update will bring a few security benefits and help Ethereum achieve its goal of minimum viable issuance. This is a core principle of Ethereum's social contract, and it's all about minimizing the security spend without meaningfully impacting security, something that has traditionally been very difficult to achieve, but is made much easier with 1559. All open blockchains must incentivize the miners or validators that maintain and protect the network, and they can do this either using newly minted coins or transaction fees. But there's a problem. If the network constantly prints new money to incentivize miners, that money becomes less attractive to holders as they will lose value through inflation. Because of this, many blockchains have chosen to slowly reduce the block subsidy over time to eventually become 100% dependent on transaction fees. But this also has problems. Transaction fees are unpredictable, potentially leading to variable levels of security that may even be inadequate at times. And worse still, highly volatile fees could even be detrimental to the blockchain's security and generate instability, as miners could start reorganizing the blockchain to try and redirect very high paying blocks towards themselves. Traditionally then, networks have to choose. Do they prioritize their money and keep inflation low, or security and issue new money forever? Ethereans believe that security is the highest priority, and so Ethereum has a perpetual block subsidy, but they also recognize the downsides of this and are committed to reducing the negative impact as much as possible, hence the idea of minimum viable issuance. Until 1559, that just meant keeping the block subsidy as low as possible without endangering the network. But with 1559, they can go further. ETH supply can now be reduced, or at worst increased at a slower rate, without compromising security. In short, 1559 allows Ethereans to have their cake and eat it. Even better, 1559 makes the security budget and therefore the level of protection on offer much more predictable. With the majority of transaction fees burned and almost all incentives coming from the block reward, everyone can say with a much higher degree of certainty how much miners will earn in the months to come. There's no need to worry about demand reducing and fees drying up, because this will have no impact on security. Everything comes down to the block subsidy, which can be adjusted up and down as needed with relative ease. And in the event that an increase was necessary, 1559 should reduce the opposition to increasing it, because people are already aware that the increase will be counteracted by the burn. Finally, because the income from transaction fees will be much less than the income from the block subsidy, there will simply be far fewer opportunities where it would make sense for the miners to reorganize the blockchain to try and redirect those fees towards themselves. With all of these benefits on top of the improved usability, 1559 is clearly a positive development for Ethereum. But like everything in life, it can't all be good. So in a moment, we'll take a look at the risks and potential problems that 1559 introduces, and we'll see how it tries to mitigate those. But before we get onto that, I want to quickly talk about something that 1559 will not do. Before we move on, I want to make it really clear that 1559 will not meaningfully reduce gas prices and transaction fees in Ethereum. This is a misconception that you'll often see repeated online, but it's simply not true. Only true scaling solutions can properly help with this. Yes, 1559 may have a small impact on transaction fees by ensuring you don't overpay for gas, but you'll still have to pay the market rate for gas, which will be driven by the same levels of supply and demand that we see today. Fortunately, there are various scaling solutions in different levels of deployment and development, so the days of transactions being prohibitively expensive should soon come to an end. When they do though, 1559 will have had nothing to do with it. One concern you might have about the base fee is that it can be manipulated up or down to suit the needs of some attacker. That's probably the primary concern with 1559. So how might this attack play out, and how can the threat be minimised? Well, by its very design, 1559 makes manipulating the base fee upwards extremely expensive, and while anyone could do it, it's not obvious why anyone would do it, as there just aren't that many reasons that would justify the cost. The attack itself is pretty simple. The attacker just needs to send enough transactions to continuously double fill blocks, and Ethereum will respond by increasing the base fee by 12.5% each time. Of course, the increasing base fee makes the attack continuously more expensive, 10xing the cost of the attack after just 5 minutes, and 100xing it after 10 minutes. Realistically, no attacker would last long, and while there will be a string of mostly empty blocks for a few minutes after the attack ends, the base fee will return to its proper level almost as quickly as it was pushed away from it. But anybody who desperately needed to make a transaction in that time could probably make it into a block by paying a generous tip on top of the already high base fee. So it would be expensive but not totally unusable. Manipulating the base fee downwards is a bit harder. Only miners would be capable of reducing the base fee below its proper value, and even then, they'd need to be organised in a 51% attack. But they might have a good reason to do it. If they ignored most pending transactions and only ever produced part-full blocks, then they could pull the base fee towards zero and eventually recreate today's first price auctions. Miners would select a small number of the highest tipping transactions, no ETH would be burned, and users would be back to guessing how much they needed to pay to be included in a block. While this may sound concerning, it's actually not as much of a problem as it first appears. For starters, miners could engage in 51% attacks today, and depending on exactly how they carried it out, it could be quite profitable. More profitable, in fact, than a base fee manipulation attack would ever be. But for a variety of reasons, we don't see 51% attacks today, so there's no reason to think that they would suddenly become more likely once 1559 is in place. If anything, a 51% attack to reduce the base fee is less likely because it actually encourages miners to defect from the attacking group. This is because the aim of the attacking group is to keep blocks below their target size, but the most profitable action for each individual miner is to double fill their block with the highest tipping transactions. If we assume it's too difficult for miners to coordinate for a profitable 51% attack today, it's almost certainly too difficult for them to do it in a world where every miner is paid to defect. So we can be reasonably comfortable in saying that the base fee shouldn't be manipulated once 1559 is in place. But there's one other area that might have you concerned: the increased block size. How could double full blocks impact Ethereum's security? Could they make it less safe? Earlier, we saw that Ethereum limits the size of blocks to reduce the social and computational costs on everyone in the network. If the size limit is doubled, then it's reasonable to think that those social and computational costs would also double. You would need more computing power to process blocks, for example, and the overall size of the blockchain would grow faster as well. But it's important to note that 1559 won't bring a persistent increase in block size. It only allows larger blocks to be created when there is enough demand to justify that. And that means the actual impact on node operators should be fairly low and almost unnoticeable. In fact, nodes are already dealing with something that's kind of similar to this today. The random nature of proof of work means there will occasionally be a flurry of blocks, resulting in effectively doubled block capacity for about 5 minutes every week. Extra large blocks under 1559 aren't too dissimilar to this, so if the network functions well today, it's unlikely to struggle once 1559 is released. Overall then, there's no reason to be overly concerned about 1559 and its impact on Ethereum's security. It's not introducing any new attack vectors, and it even makes some existing ones a little more difficult or expensive to carry out. As Tim Roughgarden summarises in his excellent paper analysing the update, most of the risks in implementing EIP-1559 are the same as those for any major change to the Ethereum protocol. Implementation errors, a fork caused by some parties rejecting the changes, extra complexity at the consensus layer, additional parameters to be tweaked with every network upgrade, and the spectre of unforeseeable downstream consequences. A list of reasons to be generally cautious when making updates to Ethereum, but nothing specific to 1559. He does go on though to mention additional risks specific to 1559, where he highlights one concern that has garnered a lot of attention in recent weeks: the possibility of a hostile reception by miners. We'll talk about that in the next section. For most Ethereans, EIP-1559 is a potentially exciting but relatively unseen update, something that will work away in the background to make life a bit easier or a bit better, but without making its presence known. That isn't the case for miners though, who will immediately feel the impact of the update as it eats into their profits by burning transaction fees. And so, it's no surprise that Ethereum miners have started to voice their concerns and objections about 1559 in recent weeks. So, how worried should miners be about 1559? And how worried should users be about miners? Until 1559 is actually out, we won't really know what portion of transaction fees will be burned and what portion will go to miners, and so we won't know exactly how miners will be affected by the update. In all likelihood though, it won't be as bad as it first seems. For a long time, and perhaps even still, the majority of people assumed that virtually all fees would be burned under 1559, reducing miner income by as much as 50%. That doesn't seem realistic though. While the majority of transactions will probably pay the minimum tip and have the majority of their fee burned, a small number of transactions will likely tip significant sums in search of special treatment from miners. These transactions exist because the ever-growing financial system on top of Ethereum creates a vast number of free money opportunities that are only available to the first person on the scene. For example, only one person can actually step in to liquidate a loan that has become under-collateralized, and so anybody who wanted to do that would tip handsomely to ensure they are the ones unlocking that value instead of somebody else. In many cases, the users behind these transactions don't care how much they pay for the transaction, as long as they win it and can eke out the slimmest of profits. That means they will always overpay and ensure miners don't lose anything like 50% of their income. In fact, according to researchers Hasu and Georgios Konstantinopoulos, these transactions mean the worst case scenario for miners would be a 35% reduction in income after 1559. While that would be a sizable hit, that is a worst case scenario that assumes researchers are better than they probably are at identifying these kinds of transactions, and that ignores the fact that the number of these opportunities are only going to increase as time goes on. It's also worth noting that miners can do so much more to maximise their income from these opportunities. Because miners have final say on which transactions are included in blocks and how they're arranged, they have the ability to prioritise their own transactions to extract the full value of these free money opportunities. For this reason, these opportunities are called miner extractable value, or MEV, and they could provide miners with an additional revenue stream that offsets the fee burn and makes them even more profitable than today. So while 1559 may cause some pain for miners in the short term, It likely won't be anywhere near as bad as some are suggesting, and can probably be offset in the longer term by miners fully embracing MEV. Therefore, we can say that miners don't really need to be concerned about the impact of 1559 on them. After all, they've probably taken bigger hits from Ether's price volatility than they will from this update. But some miners are still quite angry about the change and are pushing hard against it, and that has made some users concerned about a chain split or a 51% attack once the update is activated. So how real are those concerns? First of all, because it will have a bit of a negative impact on them, it makes a lot of sense for miners to be as loud as possible about this update before it's in place, just to see if they can have it altered, or even get something out of it that is beneficial for them. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything to hear miners complaining. However, things have gone a bit beyond what you might expect from that kind of posturing, perhaps aggravated by the fact that Ethereans tend to be even more anti-miner than the communities around other proof-of-work assets. If miners don't feel listened to or respected by the Ethereum community and its developers, then it's not surprising they may resort to something like the show of force that was briefly considered. It must be especially frustrating for miners that are legitimately committed to Ethereum, that work tirelessly to support the network, and that do have genuine concerns about the reduced security budget with 1559. At the end of the day though, no matter how angry they get, the risk of miner backlash is minimal. Miners are still rational people running businesses in a highly competitive environment, so they will almost always act to maximise their profits. In this case, it will be much more profitable to continue supporting Ethereum or to transfer hash power to a different existing blockchain than it would be to attack Ethereum or try forking it into something new. Overall then, it's clear that these fears are unwarranted. EIP-1559 will likely be no worse for miners than some day-to-day price swings have been, while miners are unlikely to threaten Ethereum or cause problems for its users. So that's just about everything you need to know about EIP-1559. We've seen that it's a change to Ethereum's transaction fee mechanism that will make the cost of inclusion in a block extremely clear and obvious to everyone, ensuring you and your wallet know exactly how much to pay every time. We've seen that to make this system work, a portion of transaction fees must be burned with every transaction, which could also bring tremendous benefits to ETH as an asset and Ethereum as a network. And we've seen that despite a portion of transaction fees being burned, miners won't lose too much income, because there will always be a number of very high-paying transactions that are competing to extract the free money opportunities from Ethereum's financial system. Overall, EIP-1559 is a sizable change to Ethereum, but it's one that is well worth making. The potential risks of implementing it are massively outweighed by the many benefits, and as both a user of Ethereum and a holder of ETH, I'm very much looking forward to seeing EIP-1559 introduced in July's London hard fork. So there is a ton of content out there discussing and analysing EIP-1559 from every angle, and I read, watched and listened to a fair few pieces as I was researching and writing this. If you're looking to continue your exploration of 1559, you could do a lot worse than checking out some of the pieces that stood out to me, which I'll link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.